This video is about arithmetic with sign fractions, how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide with positive and negative fractions. Whenever you multiply and divide fractions, you don't need a common denominator, so we don't have to worry about that here. And whenever you multiply or divide with the same sign, like a negative and a negative or a positive and a positive, you get a positive result. So for this first example, since we have a negative 1/2 times a negative 4/3, our result is going to be positive. The only thing we have to worry about is this 2 and the 4 can be cross-canceled. They both have a 2 in common. So if you take away a factor of 2 for each of those, this 2 you'll get a 1 left over, and this 4 you'll get a 2 left over. And now when you multiply straight across, 1 times 2 on top is 2, and 1 times 3 on bottom is 3. So we get a positive 2/3. With our next example, we're going to be dividing a positive and a negative fraction. So the very first thing is whenever you divide fractions, the first one stays the same. You change the division to multiplication, and then you flip the second fraction. It'll become 4/3. So now we're multiplying again. So this time a negative times a positive will be a negative result still. And we can cross cancel again. This 3 and this 3 cancel out completely to leave us with 1s. And the 4 and 16 have a 4 in common, so if we cancel out a 4 here, we get a 1. Cancel out a 4 here, we get a 4. So on top, we just have 1 times 1, which is 1. And on bottom, we have 4 times 1, which is 4. So we get a negative 1/4. Whenever you add or subtract fractions, you have to have a common denominator. So that's what we're going to work on first. The way I do it is I take the denominators and I factor them into primes. 15 is 3 times 5, and 9 is 3 times 3. And then I build the common denominators by balancing out the denominators. For example, look at your 3's. The second denominator has 2 3's, and the first one only has 1. For these to be the same number, they're both going to have 2 3's. So I need another 3 down here, so I'm going to multiply 3 on top and bottom. So now both denominators have 2 3's, and I've balanced it out by multiplying it 3 on top as well. Now to balance the 5's though, this one only has 1 5, but this one doesn't have any. So we're going to need another 5 here, and we'll balance it by putting it on top and bottom. So times 5 times 5. Now you can see each denominator is the same, so we can put it all back together. We have a negative, on top we have 6, and on bottom we have 9 times 5, which is 45. That is our common denominator. And the other fraction, 1 times 5 on top is 5, and again we have a 45 on bottom. So we've created our common denominators. Now the next thing we have to worry about is we're adding with a negative and a positive. Since we have common denominators, we can kind of ignore the denominators and focus on the top. What we're really trying to figure out is what is negative 6 plus 5? Whenever you add positive and negative numbers, positives and negatives cancel each other out. So I know that 5 of these positives, or these 5 positives, are going to cancel out 5 negatives over here, and we're going to have 1 negative left over. So our result will be a negative 1 over 45. The other way to think about it is with money. Anytime you're adding positive and negative numbers, I think of this as a negative 6, meaning you owe $6, and a positive 5 as you have $5. If you owe 6 and you have 5, you can pay off those 5 and still owe 1. So a negative 1 over 45. Here we're subtracting two negative fractions, so we're going to need a common denominator, but first, anytime you subtract with negative fractions, you always want to turn your subtraction into addition by using the principle we call adding the opposite. So the way that works is your first fraction is always going to stay the same, so we're going to be stuck with negative 1/3. Your subtraction becomes a plus, that's the add part, and add the opposite. And the second fraction always has to switch its sign, so the opposite of a negative 4/9 will become a positive 4/9. So by adding the opposite, you can always turn a subtraction problem into addition, which will make it a little bit easier to deal with. Now here, if we want a common denominator, it's a little bit simpler because these are both powers of 3. This is 3 times 1, and this is 3 times 3. So we can basically take this and multiply by a 3 on top and bottom to turn this into a fraction over 9. So 9 will be our common denominator. So we get a negative 3/9 plus a positive 4/9. And now we're adding with a negative and a positive. These 3 negatives will cancel out 3 of these positives, and we'll be left with the positive 1 over 9.